I don't need charity. I just need enough for groceries. He was 96 years old, a war hero, and he was standing in a pawn shop, placing 3 medals on a glass counter with trembling hands: a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a Distinguished Service Cross. Not for rent, not for medicine, for groceries. The man who jumped out of an airplane over Nazi-occupied France at 17, who ran into open gunfire 3 times to drag dying men from the snow at Bastogne, was now begging a stranger to put a price on his honor. Then one girl made one post, and 195 Hells Angels answered. If that doesn't break something inside you, nothing will. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will restore every bit of faith you've lost in humanity. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Sarah Mallory had worked the counter at Denton's Pawn and Trade for going on 6 years, and in that time she had seen just about everything a person could bring through that door. Guitars with broken necks, wedding rings still warm from someone's finger, old televisions, coin collections, power tools, and once, memorably, a taxidermied bear that the owner swore had belonged to a minor league baseball team's mascot. She had learned early on that the best thing she could do in this job was keep her face neutral. You didn't react, you assessed. You made an offer, you moved on. But the moment that old man walked through the door on that Tuesday morning in late October, something shifted inside her chest that she could not explain and could not stop. He didn't rush. He didn't look around nervously the way some people did when they came in for the first time, embarrassed by what they were about to do. He walked slowly, deliberately, the way a man walks when he has already made peace with a decision that cost him everything. He was wearing a button-down shirt, pale blue, pressed carefully despite the fraying at the collar. His trousers were clean. His shoes were polished. That detail hit Sarah harder than anything else. He had polished his shoes to come sell his medals. He had dressed up for his own humiliation. He reached the counter and set down a small velvet box, the kind you'd see at a jeweler's. Dark navy, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. He didn't open it immediately. He just rested both hands flat on the glass and looked at her. And his eyes were the palest blue she had ever seen. The kind of blue that made her think of winter sky over still water. Clear, quiet, exhausted. "Morning," he said. His voice was steady. That surprised her. "Good morning," she replied. "What can I help you with today?" He opened the box. She had seen medals before. Veterans came in more often than people realized, especially older ones, especially after a spouse passed or the bills started piling up. She had a practiced response ready, a gentle way of explaining market value versus sentimental value, a careful script for navigating the transaction without making anyone feel worse than they already did. But she forgot every word of it the moment she saw what was in that box. The Purple Heart sat in the center, its ribbon still vivid after all these decades. Beside it, the Bronze Star, the small V device for valor still attached, still gleaming. And on the right, the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, its eagle wings spread wide, polished to a mirror shine. She had been working at Denton's for 6 years, and she had never once seen a Distinguished Service Cross. Her throat closed. "These are yours?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. The question came out before she could stop it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He folded his hands together on the counter. His knuckles were large and knotted, the hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life. "I was hoping you could tell me what you'd give for them." Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sir, may I ask? Can I ask your name?" "John," he said. "John Winters." "Mr. Winters," she steadied herself. These are significant pieces. The Distinguished Service Cross especially. Can I ask what branch you served in?" Something shifted in his expression. just for a moment, like a door opening into a room full of light and then closing just as quickly. Army, he said, 101st Airborne, Second World War. She stared at him. She did the math without meaning to. If he was in the 101st Airborne in World War II, then he had to be in his 90s. She looked at him again, really looked. The posture still straight despite the trembling, the pressed collar, the polished shoes. How old are you, Mr. Winters, if you don't mind my asking? 96, he said, and then quietly, almost to himself, 96 years old and I can't afford a week's worth of food. There's something funny about that, I suppose. I'm just not laughing. Sarah felt the floor shift under her feet. She had handled difficult transactions before. She had looked into the faces of people at the end of their rope, and she had maintained her composure because that was what the job required. But something about the simplicity of what he had just said, not rent, not an emergency medical bill, not some catastrophic loss. Groceries. The man was selling his Distinguished Service Cross for groceries. Mr. Winters, she said carefully, I'm going to need to consult with our specialist on pieces like these. It's standard procedure for items of this caliber. Would you be willing to wait just a few minutes? He nodded. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a long time already and had learned that waiting was simply what life was now. She stepped into the back room, and the moment the door closed behind her, her hands started shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the wall. She was not going to do this. She was not going to stand behind that counter and put a dollar figure on what that man had done for his country. She was not going to hand him $50 or $100 or whatever the cold calculus of metal and age and market demand produced, and send him home with a bag of groceries and nothing left to show for the fact that he had jumped out of an airplane over Nazi-occupied Europe when he was 17 years old. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers were still shaking when she opened the Millfield Community Facebook page. She had been a member for years, used it mostly to check about road closures and lost dogs. She started typing without overthinking it because she knew if she thought too hard, she'd talk herself out of it. I need help from this community right now. I work at a pawn shop and I have a 96-year-old World War II veteran sitting at my counter who came in to sell his war medals, including a Distinguished Service Cross, to pay for groceries. I am not making this up. His name is John Winters. He served in the 101st Airborne. This man gave everything for this country, and right now, he cannot afford to eat. If anyone can help, if anyone knows him, please respond immediately. I don't know what else to do. She hit post. She stood there in the back room for 30 seconds, listening to the silence on the other side of the door, imagining John Winters sitting at the counter with his velvet box, waiting patiently, his shoes polished, his hands folded. Then her phone buzzed. She looked down. A like, then a share, then a comment. Sharing this everywhere. This is heartbreaking. Then another buzz, and another, until the vibrations were coming so fast they blurred together, and the screen was filling faster than she could read it. She took a breath and went back out front. John was sitting on the stool she kept behind the counter for elderly customers. She'd moved it out for him without thinking, the way you do things automatically when your body knows something your brain is still catching up to. He had the velvet box closed again. He was looking at his hands. Mr. Winters, she said, keeping her voice level, our specialist is actually going to take a little longer than I expected. Can I get you some water? Coffee? He looked up. Coffee would be nice, he said. Haven't had a cup yet today. That landed on her like a weight. He hadn't had coffee because he was rationing it. She was certain of it without him saying so. She poured him a cup from the pot in the back, brought it out with 2 sugar packets because she didn't know how he took it, and watched his face change when he wrapped both hands around the mug. Such a small thing, such an enormous thing. 101st Airborne, she said, because she needed to keep him talking. needed to keep him there. Were you in Normandy? He looked at her over the rim of the mug. D-Day, he said. June 6th, 1944. I was 17. He paused. Lied about my age to enlist. My mother cried for a week. Told her I'd be back before she knew it. He smiled, and the smile was soft and complicated. I was gone for 3 years. Were you scared? The question came out before she could stop it, and she felt immediately foolish for asking. But John just turned the mug slowly in his hands and considered the question the way a man considers something he has thought about for 8 decades. Son, he said, and then caught himself with a small laugh. Sorry, force of habit. I used to tell my boys that the only honest answer to that question is yes, and anyone who tells you different either wasn't there or forgot what it felt like. He looked up at her. But here's the thing about being scared, young lady. Being scared and doing it anyway. That's the whole thing. That's all there is. Everybody's scared. The question is what you do next. Sarah felt something in her chest that she could not name. She was looking at this man, and she was thinking about the 17-year-old boy who had jumped out of an airplane into the dark over France, with the whole world on fire around him. And she was thinking about the 96-year-old man sitting in front of her who had polished his shoes to sell his medals for groceries. And she was thinking about all the years in between, all the life between those two moments, and she wanted to say something worthy of it, and she could not find the words. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. The post had over 200 shares already. The comments were pouring in faster than she could read them. And then she saw it. A comment from a profile with a bald eagle avatar and the name Sarge, Hell's Fire MC. It said, "Where is this pawn shop? Right now. Address." She hesitated for exactly 1 second and then typed the address. The reply came back in under a minute. Don't let him leave. Sarah looked up at John Winters, who was finishing his coffee with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to be grateful for small things. Mr. Winters, she said, and her voice only wavered slightly. I think our specialist might be available after all. I'd really like you to stay a little longer if you're able. He looked at her, those pale blue eyes, patient and old and wise. You're stalling, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, made gently, the way a grandfather corrects a grandchild. She felt her face go hot. I'm sorry, I don't want to do this transaction. I don't think it's right. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I appreciate that, young lady. I do. But a man has to eat. I know, she said. I know, please, 5 more minutes, please. He nodded slowly. He set the empty mug down on the counter. He looked at the velvet box. He looked back at her. 5 minutes, he said. She didn't know if it would be 5 minutes or 5 hours. She didn't know if that comment on Facebook was a real person or a joke or something she was going to regret. She only knew that she could not let this transaction happen, and she could not explain why it mattered so much, except that sometimes a moment arrives in your life and you recognize it as the kind of moment that defines what you actually believe, as opposed to what you think you believe. And this was that moment for Sarah Mallory. She heard the sound first. It started as something distant, something she couldn't immediately identify, like weather changing on the horizon. A low vibration, almost below hearing, that she felt more in her sternum than her ears. She frowned. She walked to the front window. The street outside Denton's Pawn and Trade was a modest, 2-lane road on the edge of town, not a place that usually saw much traffic on a Tuesday morning. There was a hardware store across the street, a diner 2 doors down, a used bookshop that had been there since before she was born. It was quiet. It was always quiet. It was not quiet now. The sound was growing. The vibration in her chest was growing with it. She pressed close to the glass and looked down the street to the east, toward where the road curved past the water tower, and what she saw made her breath stop in her throat. Motorcycles. Not 2, not 10. An unbroken river of motorcycles, Harley-Davidsons, rolling around that curve in formation, 2 by 2, filling the lane, the sound of their engines building into something that she could feel in her back teeth, in her rib cage, in the soles of her feet. Black leather, chrome glinting in the October light, and at the front of the column, a man on a dark red Road King with handlebars like open arms, big as a barn door, gray-bearded, riding with the kind of easy certainty that made it clear he had spent more of his life on a motorcycle than off one. He pulled to a stop in front of the pawn shop. Behind him, the motorcycles kept coming and kept coming. They filled the street for as far as she could see, engines settling into a rumbling idle that shook the windows in their frames. John Winters had turned on his stool. He was looking at the window. His expression was unreadable. "What in the world?" he said quietly. The bell above the door chimed. The man from the Road King walked in. He was not a small man. He was wearing a black leather vest over a long-sleeved shirt, patches covering every inch of the vest surface. And when he took off his sunglasses, his eyes were sharp and dark, and moved around the room with the habitual alertness of a man who had spent time in places where that alertness kept you alive. He looked at Sarah. He looked at John. He crossed the floor in 4 steps and stopped in front of the old man and extended a hand the size of a catcher's mitt. "John Winters?" he said. His voice was a bass rumble that matched the sound still coming from outside. John looked at the hand. He looked up at the man. He took the hand and shook it. "That's me," he said. "My name's Sarge," the big man said, "and I've got about 195 guys outside who'd like a word with you, if you don't mind." John Winters looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the velvet box on the counter. He looked back at Sarge. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. And Sarge, this mountain of a man, this road-worn veteran of a different kind of service, Sarge laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and sudden, and it filled the room the way thunder fills a valley. "No, sir," he said. "You are most definitely not in trouble." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, settled, became something quieter and more serious. "We heard what you were about to do, and we're here to make sure you don't have to." John Winters didn't move for a moment. He sat very still, and Sarah, watching from behind the counter, saw something happen in that old man's face that she had no word for. Some internal wall, long held, beginning very slowly to crack. "I don't need charity," John said. The words were steady, but the voice behind them was not. "No, sir," Sarge said. "This isn't charity. This is a debt, and we intend to pay it." Outside, the engines rumbled. The windows shook, and 195 men sat waiting on their motorcycles in the October light, waiting for the word from their leader that the old soldier was ready to be found. John Winters looked down at his hands. He looked at the velvet box. He looked up at Sarge, and his pale blue eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights overhead. "Son," he said, and this time he didn't catch himself, "I haven't had anyone call me a hero in a very long time." Sarge put a hand on the old man's shoulder, carefully, the way you touch something fragile that you want to be sure is real. "Then it's been too long," he said. The hand on John Winters' shoulder was the first time anyone had touched him with gentleness in longer than he could remember. That was the thing that got him. Not the money, not the crowd outside, not the sound of all those engines vibrating the glass in the window frames. It was that hand, placed carefully on his shoulder, the way you'd place it on something you were afraid might break. And the simple weight of it undid something in John's chest that he had spent the better part of a decade keeping tightly fastened. He did not cry. He had not cried since 1952, when his older brother Raymond died of a heart attack at 41, and he was not about to start now, not in a pawn shop, not in front of strangers. But his jaw tightened, and his throat worked, and he looked down at the velvet box on the counter for a long moment before he trusted himself to speak. "You said your name was Sarge," he said finally. "That's right. Is that what your mother put on your birth certificate?" Sarge's mouth curved. Gerald Hutchins. But nobody's called me that since about 1987. Gerald, John nodded slowly, as though he was filing it somewhere important. "You said you served. What branch?" "Marines. 2 tours in Vietnam. Got out in '74. He paused. "Nothing like what you did. I know that." John looked up at him sharply. "Don't do that," he said. Sarge blinked. "Sir? Don't minimize what you did." John's voice had an edge to it now, a steel wire running underneath the age and the exhaustion. "You served. You went when they called you. That's not nothing, son. Don't let anybody tell you it's nothing, not even yourself." The room went quiet. Sarah, behind the counter, had stopped pretending to look at paperwork. She was watching the two of them the way you watch something that you know you're going to try to describe later and already suspect you won't find the right words for. Sarge stood very still. Something moved across his face, quick like a shadow crossing water, and when it passed he looked different, younger somehow, and at the same time older. "Yes, sir," he said. That was all. 2 words, but he said them the way a man says something he's needed to hear for a long time. Then Sarge straightened up and reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He pulled out a roll of cash that made Sarah's eyes go wide. It was not a small roll. It was the kind of roll that had a rubber band around it because nothing else was going to keep it together. Thick and heavy, and he set it on the glass counter next to the velvet box with a sound like a decision being made. "This is from me," Sarge said, "personally, before we get to the rest." John stared at the money. He didn't reach for it. "How much is that?" "Enough for a few months of groceries, and then some." "I can't take that." "Mr. Winters, I said I can't take that." John's voice was firm. He turned on the stool to face Sarge directly, and whatever frailty had been in his posture when he walked through the door was gone. He was sitting like a soldier. "I've been taking care of myself since I was 16 years old. I didn't come in here looking for a handout. I came in here to make a transaction." "I know you did," Sarge said. He didn't back down. He matched the old man's directness without flinching. "And I'm telling you that transaction isn't happening. Not today. Not ever if I have anything to say about it." "You don't have anything to say about it. You don't know me." "I know what's in that box," Sarge said. "I know what a Distinguished Service Cross means, and I know what a man has to do to earn one. And I'm telling you that no piece of paper with a number on it comes anywhere close to what those medals are worth. So I'm asking you, man to man, don't do this. Let us help." John was silent. Outside, the engines idled. The sound was a living thing, filling the street, filling the shop, filling the space between the two men like a third presence in the room. "Why?" John said at last. The word came out stripped of everything except the real question underneath it. Not, "Why are you here?" Not, "Why do you care?" Just, "Why?" The whole why, the deep one. Sarge didn't answer immediately. He pulled a stool up and sat down across from John, which surprised Sarah because she didn't even know there was a second stool. He leaned his forearms on his knees and looked at the old man with those dark, sharp eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been. "My grandfather," he said, "Army, fought in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Okinawa, 3 of the worst islands in the whole war. Came home and never talked about any of it." He stopped. "He died when I was 12, alone in a VA hospital in Cincinnati. I wasn't there. Nobody was there." He paused again. "I've thought about that my whole life. Whether somebody could have done something, whether somebody should have." John watched him. "So yeah," Sarge said, "I don't know you, but I know what you are. And I know what it means that you're sitting in this pawn shop right now. And I made a promise to myself a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to do something about it." He stopped. He shrugged, the kind of shrug that carries a lot of weight. Here I am. John Winters looked at this man for a long time. He looked at the roll of money on the counter. He looked at the velvet box. He picked up the velvet box and held it in both hands and looked at it the way a person looks at something they've been carrying so long they've stopped feeling the weight until the moment they consider putting it down. You know what I thought about, he said quietly, the whole walk over here this morning? Sarge waited. I thought about Tommy Briggs, John said. Kid from Indiana, 18 years old. He was in my stick when we jumped on D-Day, landed in a tree and couldn't get down, and I was the one who cut him loose. He turned the box over in his hands. Tommy Briggs made it all the way to the end of the war, went home to Indiana and opened a hardware store and had 4 kids and died at 79, peacefully in his sleep. His voice dropped. I always figured that meant something, that I cut him down from that tree, that maybe that was the reason I made it back myself, some kind of balance. He set the box down. And now I'm sitting here and I can't balance my own checkbook. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Sarah, who had been silent for so long she'd almost forgotten her own voice, said, Mr. Winters, would you let me keep the box behind the counter? Just for today, just so it's not going anywhere. John looked at her. Then he nodded. He pushed the velvet box across the glass, and Sarah took it and held it with both hands like it was something holy, because to her it was. Sarge stood up. He picked the roll of money up off the counter and held it out again, and this time John did not refuse it. He just looked at it for a moment and then reached out and took it. He didn't count it. He didn't look at it. He held it in one hand like he wasn't quite sure what it was yet. Now, Sarge said, and his voice had shifted into something that was very much a leader's voice, easy and certain and leaving no room for argument. I'd like you to come outside and meet some people, if you're up for it. John Winters stood up from the stool. He pulled his jacket straight. He squared his shoulders. It was such a practiced gesture, so automatic, so deeply embedded in his body after 70+ years that Sarah was sure he didn't even know he was doing it. The way a soldier comes to attention. It happened in less than a second, and when it was done, he was standing differently than he had been sitting. He was standing like a man who had once been very dangerous. I suppose I am, he said. Sarge opened the door. The sound hit them both like a wave. 195 motorcycles, idling, and when the door swung open and Sarge stepped out with the old man behind him, they didn't cheer. They didn't yell. Every single one of them went quiet. The engines kept running, but the riders went still, and the stillness was more powerful than any cheer could have been. John stopped just outside the door. He stood on that sidewalk and he looked out at this sea of leather and chrome and big weathered faces, and for a moment he was absolutely motionless. Then the man nearest to him on the right, young, maybe 30, a sergeant's patch on his vest, the kind of kid John had once been leading through French fields, took off his helmet, just took it off and held it at his side and looked at John Winters the way you look at something that humbles you. The man next to him did the same, and then the next, and the next. One by one down the line, helmets coming off in silence, until every man on that street was bareheaded in the October cold, standing with his helmet at his side. John Winters made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. It came from somewhere deep, somewhere he hadn't opened in years. Lord Almighty, he said, barely above a whisper. Sarge put a hand on his back. Come on, he said quietly. There are some guys who want to shake your hand. What followed was something Sarah watched from the doorway of the pawn shop, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to find the right way to tell people about it. She would say that she watched a 96-year-old man walk down a line of motorcycles shaking hands, and that every man he shook hands with looked like they were the ones receiving something, not giving it. She would say that some of them, the older ones especially, the ones who had served themselves, held onto his hand a few seconds longer than they needed to, and that John didn't rush any of them. She would say that he stopped and talked to each one like he had all the time in the world, even though 15 minutes ago he'd had nowhere to be and nothing to look forward to. She would say it was the most dignified thing she had ever seen in her life. She was still watching when Sarge came back up the sidewalk to where she was standing. "I have to ask you something," he said. She turned to look at him. "How long has he been like this? The groceries, what's his situation?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know him. Today was the first time I'd ever seen him. He walked in and he put the box on the counter and he told me he needed money for groceries." She stopped. He was so calm about it. That's what killed me. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't embarrassed. He was just matter of fact. Like it was just the next thing that had to be done. Sarge looked out at John, who was deep in conversation with a gray-haired biker who had a tattoo on his neck and tears on his face. "Does he have family?" "I don't know. I didn't ask." Sarge pulled out his phone and typed something. He showed her the screen. It was a name, John Winters, Millfield, and a search result that went to a brief mention in a local newspaper from 2 years ago. A Veterans Day ceremony. A photo of John standing at a podium in the high school gymnasium, speaking to a room of students. The caption identified him as one of the last surviving members of the 101st Airborne Division's 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The Easy Company. Sarah read that and felt the air go out of her lungs. "Easy Company," she said. "Band of brothers," Sarge said. "The real ones. The ones the book was written about. The ones they made the whole TV series about." He put the phone back in his pocket. "And he's been living here this whole time. Alone? That's what I'm going to find out." He looked at her. "You did a good thing posting that. I want you to know that. I just didn't know what else to do." "That's usually how the right thing gets done," he said. "By somebody who just didn't know what else to do." He went back out. She watched him go. Inside the shop, the velvet box sat behind the counter, and she kept looking at it while she waited. She thought about the Distinguished Service Cross inside it. She thought about Easy Company. She thought about a 17-year-old boy telling his mother he'd be back before she knew it, and being wrong by 3 years, and what those 3 years had contained. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a comment on the Facebook post from someone who said he was John's neighbor. He'd seen the post and he was angry, not at Sarah, but at himself, because he said he'd known John for 11 years and he'd had no idea. He said John had never mentioned struggling. He said John had never asked for anything. He said the last time he'd seen John was 2 weeks ago, and John had waved from his porch and said he was doing fine. And he had believed him because John always said he was doing fine, and he had never once thought to ask anything different. Sarah typed back, "Where does he live? Is his house? Is he okay there?" The reply came fast. "I think the roof has been leaking since spring. He never said anything. I should have checked. I should have looked." She read that and felt something harden in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was something made of both. She went back to the door and looked for Sarge. He was in the middle of the street talking to 3 of his men. She didn't want to interrupt, but she walked out there anyway, because the information in her hand felt urgent, felt like something that changed the shape of the situation in ways that had to be dealt with now. "Sarge," she said. He turned. "His roof is leaking." He looked at her for one moment and then turned back to his men. "Martinez," he said, "I need you to call Deacon and have him start a phone tree. Tell every man who's got any kind of construction background to pull up. I want to know what we're working with." He pointed. "Ruiz, I need you to find out this man's address and get eyes on the property before we take him there. I don't want him walking into something that's going to break him." He looked back at Sarah. "Anything else?" "His pantry might be empty," she said. He nodded. He turned to a 4th man. "Grocery run, full list. Enough for 3 months." He paused. "No, 6. 6 months." The man was already on his phone. Sarah stood in the middle of it all and watched it happen with a feeling she couldn't name. This was a machine in motion, she realized. Not a random gathering of good intentions, but something organized, something that ran on the engine of years of brotherhood and the absolute certainty that when the call came, you answered it. These men had not debated whether to come here. They had not weighed the pros and cons. One post on a Facebook page and they had ridden, because that was what they did. And the clarity of it, the simplicity of it, was something she had not expected to find today when she drove to work on a Tuesday morning, thinking about nothing in particular. John was making his way back down the line now, still shaking hands. He had reached the end nearest the door, and he stopped at a young man, maybe 25, who was shaking visibly. Not from cold. "Son," John said to him, in the same tone he'd used with Sarah when he'd caught himself, the tone of long habit and deep affection. "You okay?" "My grandfather," the young man said. He swallowed. He was in Korea. He passed last year. And I always wished I'd—" He stopped. His voice was done. John put his hand on the young man's arm, his knotted, trembling hand with its decades of work worn into every knuckle. "He knew," John said. "Whatever you're carrying right now, he knew. Veterans always know. We don't need it said." He squeezed once. "You're here today. That counts. That counts for something." The young man nodded. He couldn't speak. He put his hand over John's and held it for a moment, and John let him, standing steady on that sidewalk in October. This old soldier who had come in to sell his honor and was now holding someone else's grief like it was the easiest thing in the world. Sarah watched that and understood something she had not understood before. Something about what service actually means. Not just the fighting and the sacrifice and the medals in a velvet box, but this, the steady willingness to carry others' weight even when your own load is crushing you. Even when you can't afford groceries. Even when your roof leaks all spring and summer, and you wave from your porch and tell your neighbors you're fine, because asking for help has never once been a language you learn to speak. Sarge appeared at her shoulder. "We're going to take him home," he said. "We'd like you to come, if you're willing." She looked at him. "I'm working." He looked at the empty pawn shop behind her. "Really?" She thought about it for approximately 1 second. "Let me get my keys." She was reaching for her jacket when she heard Sarge's phone ring. He answered it, listened, and his whole body changed. She saw it happen, some shift of muscle and posture that was too subtle to describe, but impossible to miss. She stopped. "What?" Sarge lowered the phone. He looked at her and then looked at John, who was 20 feet away, and then looked back at her. "What?" she said again. "My guy at the house," Sarge said quietly. "He just sent me a photo." He held up the phone. She looked at the photo. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing, and then it landed all at once, and she put her hand over her mouth. It wasn't just the roof. The photo showed a house that had been losing its fight for a long time. Not just the roof, though the roof was bad enough. The image showed a dark, spreading stain across the ceiling of what appeared to be the living room. A watermark so large it covered nearly the entire surface. The kind of damage that didn't happen in one season. This had been happening for years. But it was what Ruiz had photographed through the front window that stopped Sarah cold. The living room had almost nothing in it. A single chair pulled up close to a small television. A folding table, one lamp, and on the walls the only decoration in the entire visible space, framed photographs. Dozens of them covering every inch of available wall. Faces and moments and places that Sarah couldn't make out in the photo, but understood instinctively. Memories. The furniture of a life stripped down to almost nothing, and the only thing left standing was memory. "How long has he been living like that?" she said. Sarge put the phone back in his pocket. "Too long." His jaw was tight. "Way too long." She looked at John, who was still down the sidewalk, now sitting on the running board of someone's motorcycle because the young man he'd been comforting had offered it, and John had accepted because his knees had been giving him trouble since 1987, and he wasn't too proud to sit. He was laughing at something the young man had said. Actually laughing, his whole face changed by it, and the sound of it carried even over the idle of the engines. "He doesn't know you've seen it," Sarah said. "No. Are you going to tell him?" Sarge thought about that for a moment. "Not yet," he said. "Not here. He's got enough to process right now." He looked at her sideways. "You good at keeping a straight face?" "I work in a pawn shop," she said. "It's my primary skill set." That got a short laugh out of him. Then he was back on his phone, and she could hear the low, rapid instructions going out. Names, tasks, timelines, the whole operation spinning up with a quiet efficiency that made her realize this was not the first time these men had mobilized for something like this. Maybe not for a veteran specifically, but for someone who needed more help than they were asking for. She got the sense, watching Sarge work, that this was simply who they were, and that the surprise was not that they had come, but that the world was still surprised when they did. She went back inside to get her jacket and her keys, and to lock up the shop, and she stood for a moment at the counter with her hand resting next to the velvet box. She thought about picking it up and taking it with her, and decided against it. It felt wrong to move it without asking John. It was his. Everything in it was his. She would tell him where it was, and he could decide. She was turning to go when the door opened and a woman came in. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a Millfield Gazette lanyard around her neck, and carrying a phone already oriented horizontally for video. "Hi," she said quickly. "I saw the post on the community page. I'm Diane Cho. I write for the Gazette. Is it true there's a World War II veteran here who—" "He's outside," Sarah said. She said it flatly, not unkindly, and then added, "But I'd ask you to be careful about how you approach him. He didn't come here for attention. He came here because he was hungry. So if you put a camera in his face before you've said hello, I'll ask you to leave. That's not a threat, it's just—" She stopped. "He deserves better than that." Diane lowered the phone slightly. She looked at Sarah with an expression that recalibrated. "Okay," she said. "Fair enough." She paused. "Can I ask, how did this start? Were you the one who posted?" "Yes." "Why?" Sarah picked up her keys. "Because I didn't know what else to do," she said, and she was aware, even as she said it, that she was repeating Sarge's words back into the world, and that they felt no less true the second time. She went outside. What happened next moved fast. The way things move fast when a plan that's been running in the background suddenly surfaces and becomes visible all at once. Sarge gathered 6 of his men, not the whole group, just 6, chosen by some calculus of capability and personality that Sarah didn't see but could feel, and explained to John that they'd like to escort him home. He said it simply. He didn't mention the photo. He said the guys wanted to see where he lived and make sure everything was all right. And John looked at him with those pale blue eyes and said, "It's a bit of a mess, I'm afraid." "We've seen messes," Sarge said. "I haven't had a woman in that house in 12 years, John said. He glanced at Sarah. "No offense." "None taken," she said. "My wife, Eleanor." He said the name carefully, the way you say a name you say rarely because saying it costs something. "She passed in 2012. 12 years. He shook his head slowly. "You'd think you'd get used to the math of it. You don't." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the young man, the one who'd been crying, whose name Sarah had learned was Danny, said, "What was she like?" John looked at him. The question seemed to catch him off guard. And then something in him relaxed, like a fist slowly opening. "Stubborn," he said. "Lord, she was stubborn. Wrong about almost everything and absolutely certain about all of it. Best cook I ever knew. Could fix a car engine and bake a pie on the same afternoon, and never once thought either of those things was remarkable." He smiled. "She thought I was funny," which was her most significant character flaw since I am not actually funny. But she laughed anyway, for 61 years, and I cannot explain to you what that does to a man. Danny nodded like he understood more than he should have at 25. She sounds incredible. She was, John said. She absolutely was. He looked down at his hands. She would have had something to say about all of this. She always had something to say. The quiet after she left. He stopped himself. Well, you don't need to hear an old man talk about quiet. Yeah, we do, Danny said. Immediately, no hesitation. John looked at him for a moment, surprised, and then that laugh came back. That real, full, unexpected laugh, and he clapped Danny once on the shoulder with his knotted hand. You're all right, kid, he said. You're all right. They got him into the passenger seat of Sarge's truck. The Road King was not a practical vehicle for a 96-year-old, a fact Sarge acknowledged without making a thing of it, and Sarah took her own car, following the small convoy out of the parking lot and onto the road, and she watched in her rearview mirror as the remaining 189 motorcycles fell into formation behind them, and the sight of it, this river of black leather and chrome following one old man home, made her grip the steering wheel hard just to have something solid to hold. The drive was 12 minutes, she knew because she counted. They turned onto his street and she heard, even from inside her car, the change in Sarge's voice through Danny's phone. Danny had called her so she could hear the conversation in the truck. Sarge had seen the house now, in person, for the first time, and he was working very hard to keep his voice neutral. Nice neighborhood, he said. Used to be nicer, John said. I used to keep the yard up. Knees don't cooperate the way they did. Sure, Sarge said. Sure, I get that. And then John said quietly, I know it looks bad. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds and felt much longer. It looks like a house that needs some attention, Sarge said. Nothing that can't be fixed. The roof's been leaking since April, John said. He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Matter of fact, no drama, just the plain statement of a plain fact. I've got buckets in the bedroom. I move them around depending on where the water comes in. He paused. I called a roofer last spring. He said $4,000. I said thank you and showed him out. Sarah, listening through the phone, closed her eyes for a second. Buckets. This man who had jumped out of airplanes over France and earned the second highest military honor in the country had been sleeping with buckets around his bed because the roof leaked and he couldn't afford to fix it. She heard Sarge exhale, slow and controlled. We're going to take a look at that, he said. You don't have to. We're going to take a look at that, Sarge said again, same tone, no argument in it. John was quiet for a moment. Gerald, he said. Sir, you're a stubborn man. Guilty, Sarge said. Eleanor would have liked you, John said, and Sarge said very quietly, that's the best thing anybody's said to me in a long time. They pulled up. Sarah parked behind the truck and got out and looked at the house, and she had been prepared from the photo for what she was going to see, and she still wasn't fully prepared. It was a small house, a single-story bungalow, and it had once been well kept. She could see the evidence of that in the bones of the place, the pride of it, the careful choices someone had made decades ago about shutters and flower boxes and a flagpole mounted beside the front door that still held a flag, faded but present. Eleanor had probably planted those flower boxes. Eleanor had probably chosen the color of the shutters. And John had maintained all of it for as long as he could, and then age and money and the indifferent arithmetic of a fixed income had caught up, and the house showed every year of that catching up. But the flag was still there. That was the thing Sarah kept coming back to. The flag was still there, faded and present, flying over everything. John got out of the truck and stood looking at his own house for a moment, and she could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the way a person braces themselves for the judgment of others. It's seen better days, he said. So have I, Sarge said, falling into step beside him. They went inside. Sarah followed, and behind her she heard trucks pulling up and doors opening and the sound of men moving with purpose. But she kept her attention on John, who was walking through his own front door with the careful attention of someone noticing their home through other people's eyes for the first time. The photographs were everywhere. She had been right about that. Every wall was covered with them, and up close she could see what they contained. A young man in a uniform who she almost didn't recognize as John until she looked at the eyes, those same pale blue eyes, and then she saw him clearly. A woman laughing at something off camera, dark-haired and beautiful, who had to be Eleanor. Children, then grandchildren, then great-grandchildren maybe. Places she didn't recognize but that had the look of places that mattered. And in the center of the largest wall, framed separately and slightly larger than all the others, a photograph of Easy Company assembled in a field somewhere in England. 100 young men squinting into the sun, and John Winters standing second from the left in the third row, 18 years old, grinning like he owned the whole world. "That was taken about 2 weeks before we jumped," John said from behind her. He had seen her looking. "Aldbourne, England, June of '44. He came to stand beside her. Most of those men never came home. She didn't know what to say. She said nothing. "I think about them," he said, "every day. Some people think that gets easier. It doesn't. You just get better at carrying it." He looked at the photo for another moment and then turned away, which was a small gesture that said a great deal about how he lived. That was when Sarge came in from outside and crossed the room and took John gently by the arm. "Sir, I need to show you something." John looked at him. "Is it bad?" "It's fixable," Sarge said. "That's what I need you to hear first. It's fixable. But I want you to see it so there are no surprises." He took him through to the bedroom, and Sarah didn't follow, because that felt private. But she heard it, heard the moment John saw the full extent of the damage. 3 of the 4 ceiling corners showing water stains, a section of plaster that had given way entirely, and on the floor, 4 plastic buckets exactly where he'd said they'd be. John didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I kept telling myself I'd call someone." "I know," Sarge said. "Pride's a funny thing," John said. "You spend your whole life building it, and then one day you realize it's the thing that's been keeping you from asking for help." A pause. "Eleanor used to say I had too much of it. She was right. She was almost always right, which I found extremely inconvenient." Sarge laughed, soft and real. "Yes, sir." "All right," John said. The words came out with the decisiveness of a man who has made a calculation and landed on an answer. "All right, what do we do?" And that was the moment, that quiet, firm, all right, that Sarah, standing in the hallway listening, would remember for the rest of her life. Not the medals, not the money, not the motorcycles or the hands taken off helmets, or any of the grand gestures. This old man in his damaged bedroom saying, "All right," and meaning it with everything he had. Sarge came out and the machinery started moving. Within 30 minutes, the house had been assessed. Martinez, who had run his own roofing company in Tucson for 15 years before retiring, walked the exterior and came back with a list. Deacon, who did electrical work, identified 3 outlets that hadn't been working since a surge in the summer. A man named Polk, who was so large he had to turn sideways to get through the bathroom door, announced that the water heater was being held together by what he described as hope and rust and needed to be replaced immediately. The grocery team called in from 3 blocks away to say they had 4 bags in the truck already and were going back for more. And Diane Cho from the Gazette was sitting on the front porch asking John questions in a voice so quiet and respectful that Sarah reconsidered her entirely. John sat in his single chair and received all of this. The assessments, the plans, the steady parade of large men with clipboards and tool belts, with a composure that was both remarkable and slightly heartbreaking, because the composure was the composure of a man who had learned to receive whatever came at him without flinching, and it had served him well in war and badly in peace. At one point, he looked up and found Sarah standing near the doorway, and he said, "You did this." "I just posted something," she said. "That's not nothing," he said. She thought about Sarge saying those same words to her, and she said, "That's what I've been told." He looked at her for a moment with those winter sky eyes. "You're a good person," he said. "I hope you know that. The world's full of people who would have made that transaction and gone home and not thought twice about it. You didn't. That matters." She felt her throat close and she nodded because it was all she could manage. Then Danny came through the front door with a bag of groceries in each arm and said, "Mr. Winters, we've got a question about the kitchen. Do you prefer your coffee on the left side of the counter or the right?" John blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "We're organizing the pantry," Danny said, completely serious. "Ruiz has strong opinions about pantry organization, and I need to know your preference before he starts making executive decisions." John stared at him for a moment, and then put his hand over his face and laughed so hard his shoulders shook. And Sarah stood in the doorway of the most damaged house she'd ever been inside and listened to a 96-year-old soldier laugh until his eyes watered. And she thought that maybe this was what it looked like when a person came back to life. But then Sarge's phone rang again. He was in the hallway, 6 feet from Sarah, and she saw his face when he looked at the screen. His expression didn't change much. He was not a man whose expression changed easily. But something behind his eyes did. And when he stepped outside to take the call, she followed him without being asked, because she had learned in the last 2 hours that when Sarge looked like that, something important was about to happen. He listened for 45 seconds. He said, "When?" and "How many?" and "Yeah." He hung up. "What?" she said. He looked at her. He looked back at the house. He rubbed the back of his neck, which she was beginning to understand was his tell, the thing he did when information had arrived that was going to complicate everything. "That was a buddy of mine at the VA," he said. "I called him after we left the pawn shop, had him pull John's file." He stopped. "And?" "John's been eligible for veterans benefits for 20 years, he said. "Housing assistance, supplemental income, the whole package. More than enough to fix that roof, pay those bills, cover groceries without breaking a sweat." He looked at her. He never applied, not once. She stared at him. "He didn't know?" she said. Sarge shook his head slowly. He knew. He told the VA rep who contacted him in 2004 that he didn't need it, that there were men who needed it more. He paused. A man who slept next to buckets in his bedroom for 6 months told the government he didn't need help because someone else needed it more. Sarah didn't have words for that. She stood on John Winters' front porch in October and felt something in her chest that was too large for words and too complicated for tears. Something made of equal parts awe and fury and grief for every night he had spent in that house alone, moving buckets while believing, down to his bones, that his sacrifice was already paid in full, and that asking for more was something other men did. "We're filing the paperwork today," Sarge said. It was not a question. "Does he know you know?" she said. "Not yet." "How do you tell a man like that?" Sarge was quiet for a moment. He looked at the faded flag beside the front door, the one still flying. "Carefully," he said. "You tell a man like that very carefully." He went back inside. Sarah stayed on the porch for another moment, looking at that flag, and she was thinking about pride and what it costs and what it's worth, and whether there's a version of it that becomes its own kind of wound when it keeps you from accepting what you've earned. She was still thinking about it when she heard John's voice from inside, steady, clear, that steel wire running underneath the age, saying, "What do you mean I never applied?" And then Sarge's voice, low and careful, saying, "Sir, I need you to hear me out." And then a silence so heavy the whole house seemed to hold its breath. The silence lasted longer than any silence Sarah had experienced in a room full of people. She came back through the front door just as it was ending. John was still in his chair. Sarge was crouched in front of him, Elbows on knees, at eye level, the way you position yourself when you need a person to know you are not talking down to them. The paperwork, Sarge had pulled it up on his phone and handed it to Danny to print at the library 2 blocks away, and Danny had run there and back in 7 minutes, was sitting on the folding table beside the chair. John had not touched it yet. He was looking at his hands. "I told them no," he said. "Back in 2004. I remember the conversation. Man called from the VA office in Columbus. Nice enough fellow. I told him there were boys coming home from Iraq who needed that money. Young men with families." "I know," Sarge said. "I meant it," John said. He looked up. His voice had a crack in it now, not of weakness, but of something like bewilderment. The sound of a man confronting a decision he made with complete integrity and has never second-guessed, suddenly seeing what it cost him. "I still mean it. Those men needed it." "They did," Sarge said, "and they got it. The program didn't run out of money because you said no. It kept going. Those men were taken care of." He paused. "But you weren't." John absorbed that. He looked at the phone in Sarge's hand, at the document on the screen, at the numbers that represented what he had been entitled to for 20 years and had declined on principle, and had never mentioned to another living soul, not even Eleanor, because Eleanor would have fought him on it, and he would have won, and he knew even then that winning that argument would cost him something he didn't want to pay. "Eleanor didn't know," Sarah said quietly from the doorway. John looked at her. Something flickered in his face. "No," he said. "She would have made you apply." "Yes," he said. "She would have made a very compelling case." The ghost of a smile. "Multiple times, loudly." "She was right," Sarah said. "She usually was," John said, "as I believe I have mentioned." He looked down at the paperwork again. The room was quiet. Martinez had stopped working somewhere in the back. Deacon had gone still in the hallway. Everyone was waiting without performing the act of waiting, which was a kind of respect Sarah noticed and appreciated. John picked up the papers. He held them the way he'd held the velvet box earlier, in both hands, with the full weight of what they represented. He read slowly. He had the reading glasses on now, pulled from his shirt pocket, and he read every word the way a man reads something he intends to fully understand before he acts on it. Nobody rushed him. Nobody spoke. It took 4 minutes, Sarah counted. When he was done, he set the papers on the table and took off his glasses, and folded them and held them in his lap and looked at the wall of photographs across the room. At the Easy Company photo, at Eleanor laughing at something off camera. "All right," he said, the same word, the same tone, the same quiet finality as before. "Where do I sign?" The breath that went around that room was audible. Not a cheer, not a celebration, just a collective release, like a fist unclenching. Danny appeared from nowhere with a pen. Sarge walked John through each signature carefully, explaining each section, and John asked 2 sharp questions that demonstrated he understood exactly what he was signing, and Sarge answered both without condescension. And at the end of it, John handed the papers back and said, "How long does it take to process?" "With my guy at the VA pushing it, maybe 2 weeks." John nodded. "I've waited 20 years. 2 weeks is nothing." He said it without bitterness. That was the thing. There was not one atom of bitterness in the way he said it. And that hit Sarah harder than bitterness would have. Because bitterness would have made sense. And this didn't. This pure, uncomplicated acceptance. And she thought that this was what 80 years of living had actually done to this man. Not hardened him, not embittered him, but worn away every layer that wasn't essential, until what was left was something so clear and so simple it was almost unbearable to look at directly. Then Polk appeared in the doorway from the bedroom, filling it completely, holding something in one hand. His expression was careful. "Mr. Winters," he said, "I need to ask you about something I found." John turned. "What did you find?" Polk came into the room. He was holding a coffee can, An old one, the metal kind, the lid pressed on tight, and he set it on the table next to the pension paperwork. And Sarah could see from John's face that he knew exactly what was in it. "Found it in the closet," Polk said, "on the top shelf. Figured I should bring it out." John looked at the can for a moment. Then he said, "That's my emergency fund." Polk nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to, because the silence said it. If that coffee can was John's emergency fund and he'd still gone to the pawn shop this morning, the emergency fund was empty, or close enough to empty that it made no difference. "How much is in there?" Sarge said, not to Polk but to John. John met his eyes. $62, he said, "and some change." Nobody moved. "That was my emergency fund," John said again, and this time the word emergency had a hollow sound, the sound of a word that has been stretched past its meaning. "I've been adding to it when I could. Took me about 8 months to get to $62. He looked at his hands. "I didn't touch it this morning because—" He stopped. He started again. "I told myself the metals were the last option, the thing you do when everything else is gone." He picked up the can and turned it in his hands. $62 felt like it was still something. Like as long as I had that, I wasn't completely— He stopped again. "You weren't completely out," Danny said softly. "Yes," John said. "That's it exactly. You're not completely out as long as you've got something." He set the can down. He looked up at Sarge. "Pretty foolish thinking for a man my age." "No, sir," Sarge said, and his voice was rougher than it had been a moment ago. "That's not foolish. That's survival. That's exactly what survival looks like." John looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them. Some recognition between two men who understood survival, not as a concept, but as a daily practice, a thing you do with your hands and your jaw and your refusal to stop. And John nodded once, and that was enough. Martinez appeared at the back door. "Sarge, roof assessment's done. You got a minute?" Sarge excused himself. Sarah watched him go, then watched John, who had picked up the coffee can again and was just holding it, not doing anything with it, just holding it. "Mr. Winters," she said. He looked up. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You've already posted my personal business on the internet," he said. "I don't see why not." She felt heat in her face. "I'm sorry about that. I acted without thinking, and I should have asked you first, and I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't apologize," he said. "I've been angry at myself about a great many things for a great many years, and I can say with authority that being angry about the wrong things is a waste of time." He looked at her steadily. "What's your question?" "Your family," she said. "Do you have children? Grandchildren?" The shift in his face was immediate and specific. Not pain exactly, something more complex than pain. The look of a subject that has its own weather system. "A son," he said. "Robert. Lives in Phoenix. He's 71. He paused. We're not close. We haven't been for a long time." Does he know how things are?" John was quiet for a moment. "I expect he has an idea," he said. "We speak on the phone at Christmas. He asks how I'm doing, and I tell him, fine." He looked at Eleanor's photo on the wall. He and Eleanor weren't— It was complicated. After she passed, there wasn't much holding the phone calls together. We do Christmas out of habit, I suppose. Same way some people go to church. He paused. I don't say that to be uncharitable. Robert had his reasons for the distance. I had mine. We're both stubborn men, and we both made choices that were too far down the road to walk back. He looked at Sarah. Some things in life you don't fix. You live alongside them. She thought about that. She thought about a son in Phoenix calling at Christmas and asking how things were and receiving the word fine and choosing to believe it. And she thought about whether that was failure or survival or simply the complicated way families erode over time, slowly like coastline, not all at once but year by year, until one day you look and the shore is nothing like it was. Should someone call him? She asked. About today? John considered the question with the same careful weight he'd given everything else. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe. I wouldn't know what to say to him. You wouldn't have to say anything, Sarah said. Someone else could do the calling. He looked at her. Are you volunteering? If you want me to. He was quiet for a long time. The can was still in his hands. Outside, she could hear Sarge and Martinez talking, the sound of it low and purposeful. And further away, the motorcycles had gone quiet because the riders had dispersed into the work of the afternoon. Some to the roof, some to the grocery run, some to the hardware store Ruiz had identified 3 blocks away, where they could get what Martinez needed. The house had gone from still to inhabited in 2 hours, and she watched John feel that change, watched him orient to the sound of people moving through his rooms the way a man orients to warmth. His number is in the book by the phone, John said. The actual book. I know nobody uses those anymore. I'll find it, Sarah said. She found it in 2 minutes. A small address book, spiral bound, with names and numbers in John's handwriting, steady despite his trembling hands because he had apparently written it years ago when the trembling was less. Robert Winters, Phoenix, Arizona. She dialed from her own cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She left a message. She kept it short. She said she was calling on behalf of his father, that John was safe and being looked after, and that she thought he'd want to know what had happened today, and she left her number. She did not editorialize. She did not say he should feel guilty, though she had thoughts about that. She said what needed to be said and stopped. She came back to the living room and told John she'd left a message, and he nodded in a way that suggested he was not surprised his son hadn't answered the phone at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Then Sarge came back inside, and the energy in the room changed the way energy changes when a decision has been made. Okay, he said, standing in the middle of the room, and his voice had the particular quality it took on when he was about to tell people what was going to happen. Here's where we are. The roof needs full replacement, not patching, full replacement. Martinez says it's beyond patching. He's already called his supplier in Columbus for materials. Crew starts tomorrow at 7. He looked at John. You're going to need to be somewhere else for about 2 days while that happens. The noise alone. I can sleep through anything, John said. I slept through the Battle of the Bulge. The debris and the dust are going to be a problem for your lungs, Sarge said. I'm not negotiating on this one. John opened his mouth. I have a guest room, Sarge said, or Danny does, or any one of about 40 guys who are going to offer in the next 10 minutes. You pick. I'm not going to impose on Danny, Sarge said. Danny stepped forward like he'd been waiting. Mr. Winters, my wife makes incredible chicken soup, like life-changing, and we have a guest room with a good mattress and a bathroom all to yourself, and a dog named Biscuit, who I promise will leave you alone if you want him to, and not leave you alone if you don't. He paused. He's a very perceptive dog. John looked at him for a moment. The resistance was still there in his posture, but it was changing shape, softening at the edges. You'd have to ask your wife, he said. I already texted her, Danny said. She said, and I quote, you better bring him. That laugh again, that real, full, rolling laugh that changed John's whole face. All right, he said for the 3rd time that day, and each time he said it, Sarah thought, it cost him a little less. Like a door that's been stuck for years and you keep working the handle, and finally the hinge gives and the door swings free, and you remember it was never supposed to be that hard. The afternoon moved. Martinez organized the roof crew. Deacon fixed the 3 dead outlets and found a 4th he hadn't been told about. Polk ordered the water heater online. Overnight delivery, his own credit card, would not hear otherwise. And 2 other men spent an hour reorganizing the kitchen while John supervised from his chair with an increasingly specific set of opinions about where things belonged, which everyone followed exactly, which made him comfortable in a way that being given things had not. Around 4 o'clock, Diane Cho from the Gazette finished her conversation with John and came to find Sarah on the front porch. She had not used the video once. She had sat across from him for 90 minutes with a notebook and a pen, old-fashioned, and written down what he said. "He told me about D-Day," Diane said. Her voice was different from when she'd walked into the pawn shop that morning. Quieter, weighted. "He told me about a kid named Tommy Briggs." "I know," Sarah said. "He told me too. He told me about a night in December of '44 in Bastogne when his unit was surrounded and it was 20 below and they had no winter gear and no food and 3 rounds of ammunition per man. And he said the only thing that kept them together was that they decided collectively, without anybody announcing it, that they were not going to quit." She stopped. She looked at her notebook. "He said the decision wasn't dramatic. He said it was just a fact, like deciding the sky is up. We're not quitting, period." She paused. "And then I looked at this house and I thought about him moving buckets in the bedroom. And I thought, he never stopped making that decision. Not once, for 80 years. Sarah didn't say anything. "I'm going to write the best piece I've ever written," Diane said. "I want you to know that. This man deserves the best thing I'm capable of." "He deserves better than fine," Sarah said. Diane looked at her. "What?" "He tells everyone he's fine," Sarah said. "He's been saying it so long I think he forgot to notice when it stopped being true. He deserves better than fine." Diane looked at the house, at the faded flag. "Yeah," she said, "he really does." At 5 o'clock, Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number with a Phoenix area code. She answered it. "This is Robert Winters," the voice said. It was a man's voice, older, with John's steadiness in it but tighter, compressed, like a version of the same material under more pressure. "I got your message. Is my father all right?" "He's fine," Sarah said, and then caught herself using the word and felt a flash of dark irony. "He's safe. He's at his house with, there are people here looking after him." "What people? Who are you?" "My name is Sarah Mallory. I work at a pawn shop. Your father came in this morning to sell his war medals to pay for groceries." The silence on the other end of the line was a different kind of silence from all the silences she'd sat in today. This one had texture. This one had something moving inside it. "I didn't know," Robert said finally. "I know," Sarah said. She kept her voice neutral, the same voice she used behind the counter, the voice that assessed without judging. "He's been telling everyone he was fine." "He tells me he's fine every Christmas," Robert said, and his voice cracked on the word Christmas in a way he clearly had not intended. He recovered fast. I should have pushed harder. I should have come." "Mr. Winters," Sarah said carefully, "there's going to be time for that. Right now your father is safe, and there are good people here working on his house, and he's been laughing more in the last 4 hours than I imagine he's laughed in a while. But I think he'd probably want to hear your voice, if you're willing." Another silence, shorter this time. "Yes," Robert said. "Can you?" "Yes." She went inside. She crossed the room to where John was sitting, watching Deacon demonstrate how the newly functioning outlets worked, with the evident satisfaction of a man who has just been shown that the world is slightly more operational than he thought. "Mr. Winters," she said. She held out the phone. "It's Robert." John's whole body went still. He looked at the phone. He looked at Sarah. Whatever he was feeling moved across his face in layers. Surprise, something older and more complicated underneath it, and then something that was almost, not quite, but almost hope. He took the phone. He held it to his ear. "Robert," he said, and then he stopped talking because his son was talking, and Sarah turned away and gave him the only privacy she could in a room full of people, and she walked to the wall of photographs and looked at the Easy Company picture, at that young man second from the left in the third row, 18 years old, grinning like he owned the whole world, with no idea what was coming and no idea he would still be here 80 years later. And she thought about all the things a person carries and all the things a person puts down, and how sometimes the two get confused over the course of a very long life. Behind her, John said, "I know, son." His voice was different. The steel wire was still there, but something alongside it had come loose, something that had been held tight a long time. "I know. I should have said something. I know." And then, quieter, "I'm glad you called." Danny appeared beside Sarah, 2 mugs of coffee, and held one out to her. She took it without speaking. They stood together looking at the Easy Company photograph and listened to John Winters talk to his son for the first time in years about something real. And the sound of it filled that battered house the way warmth fills a room you've just walked into from the cold. Slowly at first, then everywhere at once. That was when Sarge's phone went off a 3rd time that day, and when Sarah saw his face, she knew, without knowing anything else, that the story was not finished. Not even close. He read the screen. He read it again. He looked up and found her eyes across the room, with an expression she had not seen on him yet. Something that was not concern and was not surprise, but was something between the two. The look of a man receiving information that changes the shape of everything that came before it. "Sarah," he said. She crossed the room. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a message from his contact at the VA, 2 sentences, and she read them twice to make sure she was understanding correctly. The first sentence said that John Winters' file had flagged something during the benefits review that required immediate attention. The second sentence said that John Winters had never received his full commendation. The Distinguished Service Cross in the velvet box at the pawn shop, the medal he had polished, the medal he had carried for 80 years, the medal he had placed on a glass counter that morning to trade for groceries, was not the highest honor John Winters had been recommended for. Someone, somewhere, in the chaos of 1945, had filed a nomination for the Medal of Honor, and it had never been processed. Sarah read the message a 3rd time because her brain kept refusing to fully accept what her eyes were seeing. A Medal of Honor nomination, filed in 1945, never processed. For 80 years, the highest military honor in the United States had been sitting in a pile of paperwork somewhere, attached to the name of a man who had spent this morning trying to trade his 2nd highest honor for a week's worth of food. She looked up at Sarge. "How is that possible?" "It happens," he said, and his voice was controlled in the way voices get when the person using them is working hard at control. End of the war, massive backlog, units being decommissioned, men being discharged faster than the paperwork could follow. Things fell through. Files got lost. It happened more than people know. He looked at John across the room, still on the phone with Robert, still unaware. "But this one," he stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck. "This one's going to take some doing to confirm. My guy at the VA is saying the original nomination file exists. Physical file, archived in St. Louis. It was never formally denied. It was never formally approved. It just stopped." "Can it be restarted?" Sarah said. "After 80 years, can you actually?" "I don't know," Sarge said. "I'm going to find out in the next 20 minutes. He stepped outside. Sarah stood still in the middle of the room and looked at John, who was saying something quiet into the phone. And she thought about what it would mean, not the ceremony, not the medal itself, but what it would mean to this man to know that someone had tried. That in the chaos of 1945, someone who had served alongside him had looked at what he'd done and said, "This man deserves the highest thing we have to give," and had put it in writing. That he had been seen, that the seeing had happened, even if the recognition hadn't. John lowered the phone. He sat with it in his hand for a moment, looking at nothing, and then he looked up and found Sarah watching him, and he said, "He's coming." She blinked. "Robert?" "Said he can be here by Thursday." John turned the phone over in his hands. "I told him he didn't need to. He said he's coming." He stopped. The weathered face was doing that thing again, layers moving through it. He said he was sorry it took a crisis to make him pick up the phone. He set the phone on the table. I told him it took a crisis for me to put the medals on the counter, so maybe we're both just stubborn old fools. Maybe, Sarah said. Or maybe you're both just men who find it hard to ask for help. Same thing, he said, but he said it with a half smile, and she took that as progress. She did not tell him about the VA message. Not yet. She and Sarge had agreed with a look, wordlessly, the way people agree on things when they've been in an urgent situation together long enough to develop a shared language. Not yet. Let Sarge confirm it first. Let the information be solid before it lands on this man who had already absorbed more in one day than most people absorb in a year. Danny came back through from the kitchen and handed John a plate with a sandwich on it. Actual food, real food, from the groceries the team had brought. And John looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been pretending not to want. Eat, Danny said, in a tone that was somehow both entirely respectful and completely non-negotiable. Please, seriously, I'll feel better. You'll feel better, John repeated. I worry, Danny said. It's a character flaw. John picked up the sandwich. He ate. Danny sat on the floor, cross-legged like a kid, and watched him with undisguised satisfaction. And John pretended not to notice, but Sarah saw the corner of his mouth pull up. Sarge came back in 18 minutes. Sarah clocked it. She watched his face as he crossed the room to her, and his face was different. Not the controlled tension of before, but something more careful, more deliberate. The expression of a man carrying something fragile. Talk to me, she said. The nomination is real, he said. My guy confirmed. The original documents exist in the archive. Company commander's signature, witness statements, the whole package. He paused. The action it was filed for. Bastogne, December 1944. He looked at John. There was a night when his unit's position was being overrun. John went out 3 times into open fire to pull wounded men back to cover. 3 separate trips. The last one, he took a round in the shoulder, which explains the Purple Heart, and he kept going. He stopped. He brought back 4 men who would have died in the field. His commanding officer filed the nomination the next morning. Sarah was very still. He never mentioned any of that. Of course he didn't, Sarge said. She thought about John at the pawn shop counter, recounting the war when asked. Tommy Briggs in the tree, the collective decision not to quit at Bastogne, and saying nothing, not one word, about going out into open fire 3 times to pull dying men from the cold. Not once. As if it hadn't happened. As if it was simply a thing that you did when the moment asked it of you, and then you put it down and moved on. What happens now? She said. There's a process, Sarge said. Congressional review, historical verification. It takes time, months, maybe longer. There's no guarantee. He looked at her straight. But my guy knows people, and those people know people. And John Winters is 96 years old, which means if this is going to happen, it needs to happen fast. He paused. Diane Cho. Sarah understood immediately. The story. A national story about an unprocessed Medal of Honor nomination. That creates pressure, real pressure, the kind that makes processes move faster than they normally do. He glanced toward the porch, where Diane was still writing in her notebook. Her piece was going to be good. Now it needs to be more than good. Does she know yet? No. Are you going to tell John first? Yes, Sarge said. Right now. He walked across the room and crouched down in front of John's chair again. Same position as before, elbows on knees, eye level. John had finished the sandwich. He looked at Sarge the way you look at someone when you can tell by the way they're moving that they're carrying news. What did you find out? John said. Sarge didn't ease into it. He had read this man correctly all day, and he read him correctly now. John Winters did not want to be managed. He wanted to be told. Your commanding officer filed a Medal of Honor nomination for you in December of 1944, Sarge said. For Bastogne. It's in the archive in St. Louis. It was never processed. We're going to try to change that. The room was absolutely silent. John sat with that information the way he'd sat with everything else today, fully, without flinching, without performing a reaction. He breathed. He looked at his hands. He looked at the Easy Company photograph on the wall. Captain Spears, he said quietly. Sarge nodded. The signature on the nomination. He never told me, John said. Ronald Spears never said a word to me about it. His voice was very quiet. He was that kind of man. He would do a thing because it was right and not tell you he'd done it. He stopped. He's been gone 30 years. Yes, sir. 4 men, John said. He was not talking to Sarge anymore. He was talking to the photograph, to the young men in it, to the ones who hadn't come home. I brought 4 men back, Tommy Brewer, Carl Higgins, Pat O'Brien, and a kid whose name I never even learned properly. Everybody called him Dutch. He stopped. Dutch lost his right arm, but he went home. He went home. Nobody in the room moved. Then John looked back at Sarge, and his pale blue eyes were very bright, and he said, I don't need a medal for that. I need to know Dutch went home, and I know that. So, I understand, Sarge said, but Captain Spears thought you deserved one, and I think Captain Spears was right. And what we're going to do is make sure his paperwork gets the answer it deserved 80 years ago. He paused. Not for the medal, for the record. So the record says clearly what you did, so it doesn't get buried in a filing cabinet anymore. John was quiet for a long time. Then, You're a very stubborn man, Gerald. Yes, sir, Sarge said. It's been previously established. And then John said something that no one in the room expected. He said it quietly, almost to himself, but the room was so still that everyone heard it. He said, Eleanor would have cried. That was all. But the way he said it, with that precise combination of certainty and love and grief, with the knowledge of exactly how she would have cried, and exactly what her face would have looked like, and exactly what she would have said afterward when she'd composed herself, that small sentence contains 61 years of marriage and 12 years of absence, and it hit the room like something physical. Danny turned away. Not to hide it, just because he needed a moment, and he was decent enough to take it somewhere else. Sarge straightened up. He cleared his throat once. I'm going to go talk to Diane, he said. We're going to get this in front of the right people. He looked at John. You have any objection to that? John considered. I'd like to read the article before it runs, he said. Done, Sarge said. He went to find Diane. What happened over the next 72 hours moved with a speed that stunned everyone who was part of it, though in retrospect, Sarah would say it shouldn't have been surprising, because the story had everything. A 96-year-old veteran, a pawn shop, 195 motorcycles, a leaking roof, a $62 emergency fund, a son flying in from Phoenix, and buried in an archive in St. Louis, an 80-year-old act of heroism that the government had forgotten to honor. Diane Cho filed her piece with the Gazette at midnight. By 6 the next morning, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By noon, it was on every major news network in the country. By evening, the phones at the offices of 2 Ohio senators and 1 congressman were receiving more calls per hour than their staff could process, all saying variations of the same thing. Fix this now. This man is 96 years old and he doesn't have time for slow processes. John spent that day at Danny's house, sleeping in the guest room with a good mattress while the roof crew worked. And Biscuit the dog determined within 4 minutes that John was a person who needed company and stationed himself permanently at John's feet, which John accepted with the equanimity of a man who has learned that some decisions are made for you, and the wise thing is to let them be. Robert arrived Thursday morning, 7 hours earlier than he'd said, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about the phone call with his father. He was a tall man, John's height, with John's posture and John's eyes in a face that was younger and less settled, a face still working out what it believed. He stood in the doorway of Danny's guest room looking at his father for a moment before John looked up. And the moment before John looked up was the one Sarah saw. The son looking at the father, all the years between them compressed into a single second. All the Christmases and the fine how are yous and the distances maintained out of stubbornness and silence, and the misunderstanding that time was not running out. Then John looked up and said, "You got here fast." And Robert crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed and said, "I should have gotten here faster." Sarah did not stay for that conversation. It did not belong to her. She waited in the kitchen with Danny and Biscuit and a cup of coffee, and she listened to the sound of two voices on the other side of a closed door. And she could not make out the words, but she could hear the shape of them, slow at first and then faster, back and forth, and at some point the shape changed in a way she felt more than heard, like a key turning in a lock that has been frozen for years. When they came out an hour later, Robert's eyes were red, and John's jaw was set in the way it set when he was holding something steady with effort. And they were walking side by side, and Robert had his hand on his father's arm, just resting there, light and certain, and John was letting him. The roof was finished Friday afternoon. Martinez's crew, 7 men, all chapter members, all donating their time and materials on top of the funds the chapter had raised, finished 2 hours ahead of schedule because they had spent 40 years learning to work like a machine when the job mattered. When they were done, Martinez came into the living room and reported to John directly, because he had learned quickly that John needed to receive reports directly, and he told him what had been done and what had been replaced and what the roof would now withstand. And John asked 3 specific questions that made Martinez look at him with respect. And at the end, John reached out and shook his hand and said, "Good work, son." And Martinez, who was 53 years old and had his own business and his own crew and was nobody's son, stood up a little straighter and said, "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The water heater had been installed Thursday. The outlets worked. The pantry was full. Polk had ordered extra supplies without being asked and had them delivered without mentioning it. And John had found them and said nothing, which Danny reported to Sarge as the highest possible form of acceptance. 6 weeks after that Tuesday morning in the pawn shop, Sarah got a call from Sarge at 7 a.m. She answered immediately because she had learned that calls from Sarge at unusual hours contained information that could not wait. "It's moving," he said. "Congressional Military Review Board has the file. They've fast-tracked it. My contact says we're looking at a formal ceremony in the spring." She sat down. Is it confirmed?" "Not officially, but it's close. Real close." He paused. "I talked to John last night, told him where things stood." "How did he take it?" Sarge was quiet for a moment. "He said he wanted to make sure the nomination, the original nomination, would be part of the permanent record regardless of the outcome. He said he wanted Captain Spear's name on it. He said the man deserved credit for what he tried to do, even if it took 80 years. He paused again. "Then he asked me if I wanted to come for dinner Sunday because Robert is visiting and he's been teaching himself to make Eleanor's pot roast from her recipe cards, and he needs somebody to tell him honestly if it's any good." Sarah laughed. It came out of her fast and real. "What did you say?" "I said I'd be there at noon," Sarge said, "and I'd bring Danny." She was still smiling when she hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand and thought about a Tuesday morning in October, and a velvet box on a glass counter, and a man in polished shoes, and what a single post on a community Facebook page had set in motion. And she thought about the ways the world tells you that one person cannot change anything, and how the world is wrong about that, specifically and provably wrong, and how the proof was a repaired roof, and a full pantry, and a son who had come 7 hours early, and a dog named Biscuit, and a Medal of Honor nomination moving through a Congressional Review Board for for the first time in 80 years. On the last Sunday of March, in a ceremony held in the gymnasium of the same high school where John had spoken on Veterans Day 2 years before, John Winters received the Medal of Honor from the hands of a United States Senator in front of 400 people, with Robert sitting in the front row and Sarge and the full chapter standing in formation along the back wall in their leather vests with their helmets in their hands, and Danny in the second row trying very hard not to cry and failing entirely. When the medal was placed around his neck, John stood straight. He stood the way he had stood behind the counter of Denton's Pawn and Trade in his polished shoes, like a soldier, like a man who had learned that the right response to the weight of something is to stand up straighter, not to bend. They gave him the microphone. He looked out at the room. He looked at Robert. He looked at Sarge. He looked at Sarah, who was standing near the door because she had arrived late from her shift and there were no seats left. And when he found her face, his expression did the thing it did. Opened briefly, showed something true, closed back into composure. He turned to the microphone and he said, "I want to say something about the 4 men I went out to bring back." The room went quiet. "Tommy Brewer," he said, "Carl Higgins, Pat O'Brien, and a kid we called Dutch, whose real name I looked up last week, William Vandermeer of Grand Rapids, Michigan." He paused. "Dutch went home. I checked. He went home to Grand Rapids and he married a woman named Helen, and they had 3 daughters, and he died in 1998 at the age of 74. He looked down at the medal for a moment. "This belongs to those 4 men. Everything I did that night was for those 4 men. I don't stand up here to be called a hero. I stand up here because Captain Ronald Spears saw something worth writing down, and I owe it to him to stand up and receive what he tried to give me, even if it took 80 years to get here." He looked up at the room. "Take care of each other," he said. "That's the whole thing. That's everything I learned in the war, and everything I've learned in the 96 years since. Take care of each other. Don't wait to be asked. Don't wait for a crisis. Don't wait until someone walks into a pawn shop with a velvet box." He looked at Sarah again. "Just look at the person next to you and ask them how they really are, and then actually listen to the answer." He stepped back from the microphone. The room came to its feet, and along the back wall, 195 men in black leather vests raised their helmets, all at once, in silence, the same silence they had offered on that October street outside the pawn shop. Because some honors don't need sound. Some recognitions are too large for noise. And the men who understood that best were the ones who had learned it in places no one should ever have to go. John Winters stood in that gymnasium at 96 years old with the Medal of Honor around his neck and his son's hand on his shoulder, and let it all land. He did not deflect it. He did not minimize it. He stood straight and received it, finally, fully, for the first time in a life that had never once stopped earning it. Some debts take 80 years to pay, but they get paid. And on that Sunday in March, in that gymnasium, in the town of Millfield, Ohio, the last account was settled. And John Winters, who had once been a 17-year-old boy jumping into the dark over France, finally came all the way home.